She was 41 years old, and by the late autumn of 1899, she owned nothing in this world but the clothes on her back, a small trunk of her late father's tools, and $11.40 folded into a handkerchief. Her husband's own brother, Ruth Calder, had put her out of the only home she had left, calling the debt a matter of business and nothing more. With nearly all that remained of her small fortune, she paid $8 at a county tax auction for a rotting, rat-infested sawmill on the edge of Sorrel Creek, Oregon, a ruin the whole town said was cursed and not worth the paper of its deed. Everyone who watched her sign for it that day believed she had thrown away the last of her cents, along with the last of her money. What none of them knew, what she herself did not yet know, was that somewhere beneath the mill's broken conveyor lay a chest sealed shut for over 20 years, holding a secret that would not only change the whole course of her life, but set right a wrong the town of Sorrel Creek had been quietly living with for 2 decades. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Ruth Calder. If you have ever been written off by people who should have believed in you, tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Ruth Ellard was born in the spring of 1858, in a cabin not half a mile from the very mill pond that would one day hold both the beginning and the end of so much of her story. Her father, Amos Ellard, was a millwright by trade, a broad, quiet man with sawdust worked so deep into the creases of his hands that no amount of scrubbing could fully lift it out, and her mother, Alice, kept a kitchen garden and a Bible with pressed wildflowers between its pages, and taught her daughter to read from both. Sorrel Creek in those years was little more than a scattering of homesteads and a single rutted road, but Amos had a vision for it, and in 1868, with a younger, sharper-tongued man named Josiah Pruitt, he built a sawmill on the creek where the water ran fast and cold year-round. They called it the Ellard and Pruitt Mill, and for a time, the two names sat easy together on the same painted sign, and the whole town seemed to grow up around the sound of the great saw blade singing through fir and pine from first light until dusk. Because Amos had no sons, and because Alice saw no good reason a girl's mind should go unused, Ruth spent her childhood not in idle games, but at her father's elbow, learning things most girls of Sorrel Creek were never taught. She learned to read the grain of a log before it was cut, to tell by knock and echo where the rot had crept in, to keep a ledger in a clean, sure hand, and to understand that a mill, like a person, had to be listened to, that a groan in the gears or a shudder in the belts was never nothing, and a man who ignored such warnings for the sake of an extra day's cutting was gambling with more than lumber. Amos would take her down into the mill on quiet Sunday afternoons, when the great wheel sat still and dripping, and show her the bones of the place, the pulleys and shafts and the long canvas conveyor that carried the cut boards out to be stacked and dried, and he would say to her, in that slow way he had, that most people looked at a broken-down thing and saw only what it had stopped being, when the truer question was always what it might yet become. It was Josiah Pruitt who worried her father, even then, though as a girl she understood only the tightness that would come into his jaw when Josiah's name was spoken at supper. Josiah was ambitious in a way, Amos was not, forever pushing to cut more, faster, cheaper, forever chafing against the hours Amos spent greasing gears and inspecting cable that seemed, to Josiah's eye, to be running well enough. There were disagreements over money, over safety, over how much of the mill's growing profit ought to be set aside for repairs rather than paid out. Amos held firm on what he believed was right, even when it cost him standing with his partner, and it was this, more than any lesson in ciphering or carpentry, that Ruth would carry with her for the whole of her life, that a person's worth was not measured by how loudly they insisted upon it, but by what they were willing to protect, even when no one was watching and no one would thank them for it. She grew into a young woman well-liked in Sorrel Creek, quick with figures, quicker with kindness, and in the autumn of 1879, not long after her 21st birthday, the mill that had been the whole shape of her childhood was taken from her in a single terrible afternoon. A drive shaft that Amos had begged Josiah for months to have replaced gave way without warning, and in the chaos that followed, a length of chain whipped loose across the cutting floor. 3 men were killed outright, and Amos Ellard, who had run back into the mill to pull a young apprentice clear of the falling timber, was crushed beneath a stack of green lumber that the same failing conveyor had left standing unsecured. Ruth was not there that day. She was in town, at the dry goods store, when the mill's whistle sounded 3 long blasts, the signal every family in Sorrel Creek had learned to dread, and she would remember for the rest of her life the particular color of the light on the road as she ran the half-mile home, certain in her bones, before anyone told her a single word. In the terrible weeks after the accident, Josiah Pruitt moved quickly and, to Ruth's grieving eyes, coldly. He produced papers, hastily drawn and thinly witnessed, showing that Amos Ellard had sold his half-interest in the mill back to Josiah some 3 years earlier, in 1876, for a modest sum. Papers Ruth had never once heard her father mention, papers that did not match the pride and stubbornness she had watched him defend at that very supper table not 2 years before. Alice Ellard, worn thin with grief and with no means to fight a man of Josiah's growing influence, accepted a small settlement and never spoke of it again, and Ruth, only 21 and newly courted by a gentle young schoolteacher named Thomas Calder, was in no position to press a matter the whole town seemed eager to let quietly close. She married Thomas the following spring, moved with him to the town of Marsh's Landing, some 30 miles distant, and did not set foot in Sorrel Creek again for nearly 18 years, though she never once stopped believing, somewhere beneath her grief, that her father had not simply sold away the mill he loved. Her years with Thomas were good ones, quiet and modest, built on his schoolmaster's small salary and her own careful thrift, and if fortune had allowed it, she might have lived out her days content never to think of Sorrel Creek or its mill again. But fortune, as it so often does, had other plans, and it was in the winter of 1897 that a lingering fever took hold of Thomas and did not release him. Ruth nursed him through 11 weeks of it, spending what savings they had on doctors and medicines that did no good in the end. And when he died in February of that year, he left her not only her grief, but a modest debt against their small house. A debt that his older brother Elias, a man Ruth had never much liked nor trusted, had quietly co-signed years before, and now held the paper on. For 2 years, Elias allowed her to remain, taking in mending and a little schoolwork of her own to make the payments. But when a payment came 3 weeks late, in the autumn of 1899, Elias declared the note in default, called the whole balance due at once, and when Ruth could not produce it, he had the house sold out from under her with a coldness that left no room for appeal. He told her, standing in the yard as her few remaining things were carried out, that business was business, and that he was sorry it had come to this, though sorrow was not a thing Ruth ever saw cross his face. With nowhere else in the world to go, and with a strange, aching pull she could not entirely explain, Ruth boarded a wagon bound north and returned, for the first time in 18 years, to Sorrel Creek. The town had grown some, a proper main street now, a bank with Pruitt's name freshly painted above the door, but the old mill still stood at the bend of the creek exactly as she remembered it, though far more broken, roof caved in on one corner, the great wheel choked with brush, the whole structure leaning as though tired of standing. It was, the townsfolk told her, considered a cursed place, blamed by the superstitious for every misfortune that had touched the families of the men lost there, and it had passed through the county's hands for unpaid taxes so many times that no one troubled to bid on it anymore. When Ruth learned that the courthouse was holding a small tax auction that very week, with the derelict mill among the parcels no one wanted, something in her, perhaps grief, perhaps memory, perhaps something she did not yet have a name for, would not let her walk past it. The auction was held on the courthouse steps on a grey Thursday morning, and Ruth stood at the back of the small, indifferent crowd, clutching her handkerchief of coins, while the auctioneer moved through parcels of farmland and town lots with brisk efficiency. When at last he came to the mill, he read the description with something close to weary humour, calling it the Old Ellerden Pruitt Works, condition poor, value questionable, and a ripple of low laughter moved through the men gathered there. No one raised a hand. Ruth felt her heart beating strangely hard in her chest, and before she had fully decided to do it, she heard her own voice call out $8, the whole of what remained to her name, save a little over $3 she kept back for bread and lodging. The auctioneer, startled, asked twice if she understood what she was bidding on, and when she said she did, he brought down his gavel with a shrug, and just like that, the mill that had killed her father belonged to her. The laughter that followed her through town that afternoon was not unkind exactly, but it was not gentle either. Women she barely remembered from girlhood stopped her on the street to ask, with poorly hidden amusement, what on earth a widow with no husband and no money meant to do with a heap of rotten timber that decent folk wouldn't walk near after dark. An old man outside the feed store told her plainly that she'd been swindled by her own foolishness, that the mill was good for nothing but firewood and bad memories. Ruth said little in reply, only thanked them for their concern, and continued on toward the mill with her small trunk of tools riding in a borrowed handcart, though inwardly she wondered, not for the first time that day, whether she had indeed let grief and stubbornness lead her somewhere sensible people would never go. She spent her first days at the mill simply clearing it enough to shelter in, sweeping years of leaves and roosting bird debris from the small office room off the main floor, mending a section of roof with scavenged shingles, and setting her father's old tools out along the workbench in the order he had always kept them, a small, private ceremony no one else witnessed. It was on the third evening, working by lantern light to clear a jam of fallen boards from beneath the old conveyor frame, that her hand brushed something carved into the underside of a support beam, and when she held the lantern close, she found her father's initials there, A.E., cut deep and sure, alongside a second, smaller mark she did not at first recognize, a simple compass rose, the kind a careful man might use as his private signature on work he wanted remembered as his own. She sat back on her heels a long while, looking at that mark, feeling something in her chest loosen that had been tight since the day of the whistle blasts nearly 20 years before. The following morning, working to clear rot from the office wall so she could assess what timber might be salvaged, she found a loose board that gave way under gentle pressure, and behind it, wedged into a shallow cavity, a single folded page, brittle and water-stained but still legible, torn clean along one edge as though it had once been part of something larger. It was unmistakably a page from a ledger, her father's careful hand still recognizable across 2 decades, recording wages paid and lumber sold in the summer of 1876, the very year Josiah Pruitt claimed her father had sold away his share of the mill entirely. Yet here, in her father's own writing, dated well after that supposed sale, was a column headed plainly, A. Ellard half share, with figures entered beside it, as though the partnership had never ended at all. Ruth read the page 3 times over by the grey morning light, her hands unsteady, and understood, with a certainty that settled into her bones like cold water, that the papers Josiah had produced after the accident were not what they claimed to be, and that somewhere in this mill her father had left more of the truth than a single torn page. She searched with a new and quiet urgency after that, though she told no one in town what she had found, sensing correctly that the discovery of a single old ledger page would earn her only more pitying laughter, unless she could produce something no one could argue with. She went over every inch of the mill she could safely reach, tapping walls, prying at boards, working by lantern late into each evening until her hands were raw and blistered in ways that reminded her, not unpleasantly, of the calluses her father used to show her with quiet pride. It was nearly 2 weeks before she thought to examine the space beneath the conveyor itself, a low, cramped pit, accessible only through a narrow hatch near the old loading dock, filled with 2 decades of silt and fallen debris that had to be cleared bucket by bucket before she could see the pit's floor at all. What she found there, half buried and slick with damp, was a small iron-strapped chest, its hasp rusted nearly solid, secured with a heavy padlock that had long since seized shut around itself. It was not large, perhaps the size of a bread box, but it was surprisingly heavy for its size, and when she worked it free of the mud and set it on the floor of the office, her hands trembled so badly she had to sit a moment before she could even bring herself to touch it again. She tried for the better part of an hour to force the lock with tools from her father's trunk, without success, and it was only in setting those tools aside in frustration that her eye fell upon the handle of an old wooden mallet she had not looked at closely in years, a mallet that had been her father's favorite, its handle worn smooth by his grip. Turning it over absently, she noticed for the first time a fine seam near the base, and working it loose with the edge of a chisel, she found the handle was hollow, and inside it, wrapped in oiled cloth to keep the damp away, a single small key. It fit the padlock as though it had been waiting 20 years for exactly this moment, and when the hasp finally gave way with a groan of old iron and the lid creaked open, Ruth found herself looking down at the whole of what her father had tried, in the last months of his life, to protect. There was a leather-bound ledger, far more complete than the single torn page she had already found, recording not only her father's true and continuing half-ownership of the mill, but a second set of figures altogether: payments from a Portland underwriting firm, an accident insurance policy Josiah had quietly taken out on the mill's workers some months before the disaster, and a payout of nearly $3,000 issued to Josiah Pruitt in the weeks following the accident, a sum that had never once been mentioned to the grieving families of the men who died, a sum that, by the ledger's own careful accounting, was meant in significant part to provide for the widows and children left behind. Beneath the ledger lay a folded partnership deed, properly signed and witnessed in 1868, showing no record of sale, and beneath that, wrapped separately, a modest cache of gold coin, not a fortune, but enough, clearly, to have been set aside deliberately, along with a short letter in her father's hand, addressed simply to whoever should find it, explaining that he had grown afraid of what Josiah might do to protect his growing ambitions, and that he wished, if anything happened to him, for the truth, and what remained of his own earnings, to go toward making the mill's people whole. Ruth sat on the office floor a long while with that letter in her lap, the lantern guttering low, understanding at last why her father had spent his last good years so quietly watchful, and understanding, too, that what she held in her hands was not merely proof of an old wrong, but a chance, 20 years late, to finish something he had not lived to finish himself. Word travels quickly in a small town, and it was not many days before Silas Pruitt, Josiah's son, and now the owner of Sorrel Creek's only bank, learned that the widow, who had bought the derelict mill for $8, had been seen carrying an old strongbox out of the ruin, and had begun making quiet inquiries at the county recorder's office about mill ownership records from the 1870s. Silas came to the mill himself on a cold morning not long after, dressed in the kind of fine dark coat that marked him as a man of means in a town where most still wore homespun, and he was, at first, all careful courtesy, offering to buy the property back from her at a price he called generous, twice what she had paid, as a favor to a widow he claimed to pity. When Ruth thanked him kindly but declined, his manner cooled considerably, and he reminded her, with a smile that did not reach his eyes, that the mill's old machinery was worthless scrap, that the building itself was a hazard the county might yet condemn, and that a woman alone would find it a hard, foolish thing to try to run a business no man in town would trust her with. Ruth said nothing that morning of what she had found beneath the conveyor, sensing, correctly, that she would need more than her own word before she confronted a man of Silas Pruitt's standing, and in the weeks that followed, she felt the weight of his displeasure move quietly through the town. A lumber supplier who had at first agreed to sell her seasoned boards on credit suddenly found reasons to delay. Men she approached about honest day work, several of them sons of the very families her father's letter named as owed, grew strangely reluctant, murmuring about debts owed to Pruitt's bank that made them unwilling to cross him. Someone, she never learned who, though she had her suspicions, pried open her office window one night and left the room in disorder, though whether out of simple malice or a search for something more specific, she could not say for certain. The town's earlier amusement at her expense curdled, in some quarters, into something closer to suspicion, as though a woman who would not simply take a generous offer and go quietly must be hiding some scheme of her own. It would have been easy, in those weeks, for Ruth to lose heart entirely, to conclude that the mocking crowd on the courthouse steps had been right after all, that she had spent her last dollars on a ruin and a grudge she could not hope to win against a man with a bank to his name. But she thought often of her father's letter, of his quiet insistence that a thing's worth was not decided by how loudly others dismissed it, and she thought too of the widows and grown children in Sorrel Creek, who had spent 20 years believing the mill's failure was simple misfortune rather than a debt still owed to them. She began, carefully and without announcement, to visit those families herself, not to alarm them with an unproven claim, but simply to listen to their memories of the accident, to learn their names and the names of the men they had lost. And in doing so, she found that grief long carried alone is a heavy thing, and that even the smallest attention paid to it can loosen something in a person that pride and stubbornness alone cannot. It was old Constance Farrow, widow of one of the 3 men killed alongside Amos Ellard, who finally gave Ruth the peace she needed to move forward with confidence, producing from an old trunk of her own a faded letter Josiah Pruitt had sent her husband's family in 1879, offering a settlement described only as what the mill can spare. A sum far smaller than the figures in Amos Ellard's ledger showed the insurance company had actually paid out. Set beside her father's records, Constance's letter made plain and undeniable what Ruth had until then only strongly suspected, that Josiah Pruitt had collected money meant for grieving families and quietly kept the greater part of it for himself, and that her father's supposed sale of his share of the mill had very likely been forged or coerced in the desperate weeks after the accident, when a grieving widow and daughter were in no position to fight a wealthy man's version of events. With Constance's blessing, and with the careful, deliberate courage her father had once shown her how to summon, Ruth requested a hearing before the county recorder, bringing with her the partnership deed, her father's ledger, and Constance Farrow's letter, laid out with the same clean, patient order her father had taught her to keep in every column of figures she had ever copied at his side. Silas Pruitt, informed of the hearing, attended with a lawyer of his own, and dismissed the whole matter at first as the confused imaginings of a grieving woman clinging to old family papers of no legal standing. But the recorder, a careful and unhurried man named Otis Greer, examined the original 1868 deed against the county's own archived filings and found, to Silas's evident discomfort, no record whatsoever of any subsequent sale ever having been filed, only Josiah's unwitnessed private paper, which under the law of the territory carried no force at all against a properly recorded partnership. What followed was not the dramatic public reckoning that town gossip might have wished for, but something quieter and, in its way, more fitting. Faced with a documented insurance payout he could not explain, a forged sale he could not defend, and a growing unwillingness among his own depositors to keep their money with a banker so publicly shadowed by his father's dealings, Silas Pruitt chose, over the following months, to settle rather than contest, transferring to Ruth clear and undisputed title to the whole of the mill property, and agreeing, under terms Otis Greer helped negotiate, to a restitution payment drawn from the Pruitt family's own holdings to be divided among the surviving families of the men lost in 1879, Constance Farrow's among them. He did not go to prison, nor was he run from town in disgrace, but something in the easy authority he had carried through Sorrel Creek for years quietly diminished after that. Depositors moved their accounts elsewhere, invitations to the better parlors of town grew thin, and within 2 years he had sold his interest in the bank and left the county altogether, a small and unremarkable ending for a man who had once thought himself untouchable. Ruth used the restitution not for herself, but almost entirely toward the mill's rebuilding, replacing the failed gears and worn belts her father had begged Josiah to repair 20 years before, reinforcing the very conveyor beneath which his chest had lain hidden all that time. And when the mill's great blades sang through fresh-cut fir for the first time in a generation, she made certain that among the men working its floor were sons of Constance Farrow, and of the other families named in her father's letter, paid fair wages, recorded in a ledger she kept as carefully as her father had once kept his own. She did not grow rich from it, not in any way the town's earlier gossips would have recognized as success, but she built something steadier than riches, a mill run honestly, a town's trust, slowly and rightfully earned back, and a quiet peace with a grief she had carried, unresolved, for 20 long years. So we return, as we always do, to where this story began, to a widow of 41 with $11.40 to her name, standing on courthouse steps, while a crowd laughed softly at her foolishness. It would have been easy, that gray Thursday morning, to believe the crowd was right, that a woman with nothing left could not possibly see clearly what an abandoned, broken thing was worth. But Ruth Calder had learned, at her father's elbow decades before, that worth is rarely loud about itself, that it hides more often than not beneath rust and rot and the dismissive judgment of people too hurried or too comfortable to look closely, and that the surest way to find it is simply to be willing to look where others have already decided there is nothing left to find. What Ruth Calder restored at Sorrel Creek was never really a building. It was a debt, 20 years overdue, a father's quiet integrity finally allowed to speak, and a town's understanding, hard won, that the things we discard as worthless are so often only waiting for someone patient enough to prove otherwise. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Ruth's story tonight. If it moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you have a moment, we would love to know your answer to this. What is a time you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. We read every one, and we are always glad for the company. Until next time, stay close.